Good morning, students. Today, in lecture number 11, we are going to discuss in detail that poetry is a good force for good. In the previous lecture number 9, we have seen that poetry and its function of poetry, which according to William Wordsworth is a sheer self expression, as its spontaneous overflow might suggest. We have seen in lecture number 9. In lecture number 10, we have discussed the concept of poetry, and at that time, Wordsworth says in his preface to lyrical ballad that poetry is the pursuit of truth, of man's knowledge and himself, the world around him, and the poet. So, poetry is the pursuit of truth, of man's knowledge, of the world and around him, and at the same time, the comparison of poetry with the science we have seen. Though science gives you materialism, or man becomes materialism by making the discovery, innovation, invention through science. But when you invent something through poetry, in poetry you will get knowledge, pleasure, happiness, and so on. So, according to Wordsworth, poetry is greater than the science, because in science, man harms to mankind, harms to man, while poetry gives pleasure to man. So, man gives pleasure to man, while man gives harmness to man. So, this way the difference between the two. And after the function of poetry, after the pursuit of truth, we are going to discuss today that poetry is the force for good, or it is for the force for good. According to Wordsworth, we have seen that poetry is a great force for good. Poetry is a great force for good. This is one. Because initially we have discussed that poetry is the pursuit of truth, or poetry stands for the knowledge to the world and around him, to the mankind. And so, in this last phase of concept of poetry, William discusses the importance of poetry, that it is force for good. And again, Wordsworth further explains his object in writing poetry. Means he explains further his object in or of writing poetry. Initially, we have seen so many objects, primary, basic, because for the definition or for the concept of poetic diction. Now, his object in writing poetry, that he further explains that to console the afflicted. He says to console the afflicted. Afflicted is those who are in distress, pain, जो दुखात असतात, दुःख, sorrow. Afflicted means those who are in sorrow or distress. Afflicted means pain or distress or sorrow. So it means that the very object, purpose of poetry is to console the afflicted minds. Though the people who are in distress, sorrow, misery, when they go through the poetry, read the poetry, understand the poetry, they forget their sorrow, pain, distress, misery, and they get happiness. So this is the prime object of poetry, to console the afflicted. समाधान देणे जे दुःखात असते त्याला. To console the afflicted, to add sunshine, to add sunshine to daylight by making the happy happier, by making the happy happier. Root is the M and the root is the end and the gracious of every age to see, of every age to see, think and feel, to think and feel, to feel and become more virtuous. So this is little bit about the object that William Wordsworth explains in his preface to lyrical ballads, the function of concept of poetry, and here we see one by one how it is useful, important according to William Wordsworth. The very first object of poetry is to console the afflicted, those who are miserable, sorrowful, painful. When they go through the poetry, they become happy. Second, to add sunshine to daylight by making the happy happier. Because when if someone feels very dark, it's sorrowful, when he go through the poetry, that time the poetry gives daylight and makes him more happy. If one is in a sorrowful mood, it gives console to him, it gives happiness to him, it gives daylight in his life. And if one is already happy, it makes him more happier than the earlier one. So makes the happier, add sunshine in the life of the dark or miserable people, and also gives a daylight in the life of such people. And it also means poetry teach the end and the graces of every age to see. Means any man of any age, when he go through the poetry teaches him a lot, and graces to every age, which gives knowledge, blessings, happiness to every man of every age, or any man of any age, to think and feel and become more secure and virtuous than earlier. So the very object of William Wordsworth is very useful for humanity, for mankind, and the particular man who are miserable, in pain and in sorrow, they also become very much happy. And happy man, though who is already, becomes more happier, and also it also gives the knowledge, grace, or everything to any man of any age. So poetry is for forever. Poetry stands for forever knowledge, and it gives knowledge to any man of any age. So this way, the poetry object or poetry's function is good. So William Wordsworth said in the very beginning that poetry is good force or great force for good, because it gives much more which we couldn't explain, which we couldn't see. That poet gives you the knowledge. So poetry is a great force for good. It gives knowledge, it gives happiness, it consoles the mind, and also it gives the knowledge to the man of any age. He further says, Wordsworth again comes to the conclusion of this concept of poetry, and its conclusory remark William Wordsworth says that every great poet, every great poet, every great poet is a teacher. I wish he expect a wish from the reader, because he says every great poet is a teacher, because poetry teaches a lot, and so he expects that the readers has to wish either to be considered as a teacher, either to be considered as a teacher, as or as nothing, because he wished that everyone considered to the poet as a teacher, because he teaches a lot and he is teaching philosophy, or his philosophy which he teaches through his poetry makes more happy to the happier. It gives light those who are in the dark. It sunshines in the life of man who is leading a miserable life, and it consoles we can say, it consoles the distressed or painful or afflicted one, that he says. And it is makes his teachers, as a poet, as a teacher, his philosophy is, we can simply say, makes happier, and it is useful for each age of any man of any age. So he expect that poet is a teacher. So I wish means he request or expect us that we should have to consider him teacher. And again he said, he gives the reference of Plato, because Plato and Aristotle has the common things, common understanding, and he says Plato, Wordsworth has much in common, means Plato and Wordsworth has a common understanding about poetry. So Plato, in his, we can say, in his Republic, very well expresses the importance of poetry and also appreciate it as a lot, because poetry is, according to him, a knowledgeable thing, and it should be the asaina paije. As he says, Plato and Wordsworth has a common understanding. So Plato says, wanted poetry to be. Plato wanted poetry to be, means poetry must be. Poetry asaina paije, to be म्हणजे असणे, poetry ही असायलाच पाहिजे. He wanted poetry to be, as the latter everywhere insist on pleasure as being a necessary condition of poetic teaching. And Plato wanted poetry to be, and Wordsworth further says, or further adds his views, saying that pleasure as being a necessary condition of teaching of poetic teaching. So we know that Plato was a great Greek philosopher, and he is considered as the supreme in classical writing. And so Wordsworth and both Plato had same views about poetry. So in Republic, Plato expects that poetry should be, and Wordsworth continues that as poetry being a necessary condition of teaching or poetic teaching, because poet is a teacher and he definitely teaches something that the reader, learner not know. So poetry is a great invention, and it is also great medium of pleasure, happiness, and also the teaching. So, according to Wordsworth, poetry is a great force for good, and it definitely at a systematic level, in a systematic way, it stands for giving. As we have earlier seen that poetry is a philosophy one. It gives philosophy, happiness, and also it is moral and more permanent one. That also we have discussed earlier. In continuing the same concept of poetry, Wordsworth further says that poets will cooperate with, he says, poets will cooperate with the benign. Benign means we can simply say gentle or kind. Poets will cooperate with the benign means gentle or kindful ways, tendencies in human nature. Tendencies in poets will cooperate with the benign means gentle or kind tendencies in human nature and society. What is the goodness, kindness that poetry gives or explores and will in their degree be efficacious and will in their degree be efficacious. Efficacious means we can simply say the effective one. Making man, what it makes? It makes making man wiser, better, and happier. Wiser, better, and happier. This is about the poetry that William Wordsworth further says, because he says poets will cooperate with the benign means in society, whatever useful for the social member, that is also cooperates with the benign tendencies means what the man needs. That gentleness, kindness that poetry teaches in human nature and society, and it also means it will means poetry will, and the poet will in their dealings, in their proportion of knowledge, make it efficacious means make the man's life more effective than the earlier one, and also it makes man in the society wiser, better, and happier. That is the very use of poetry that Wordsworth very well highlights in his preface to Lyrical Ballad. Besides this, wiser, better, and happier, we have seen that it also makes man happy. It gives daylight in the life of miserable man, and also sunshine in the darkness. In the preface to Lyrical Ballad, William Wordsworth further says that relationship and love, Wordsworth further says relationship and love, which it is the great function of poetry, great function of Wordsworth further says that a relationship and love of mankind, which it is the great function of poetry to promote the things, to promote the ideas, or to promote the basic essence that he further says to promote, and they are to be induced to a purgation. Means further he says they are, beside this function of poetry to promote, he says they are to be induced. To be induced means succeed. Induced means succeed in leading, succeed in presenting, succeed through a purgation. Through a purgation means purify the mind, clean the mind through purgation. Purgation means we can simply say purification or cleansing. Cleansing साफ करने, purify the heart means heart साफ करने. So to succeed through a purgation means we can say clean, or we can simply say purify. So, which is the great function of poetry, they are to be induced means succeed in leading through purgation of feelings, purification of the feelings, rather than through a great appeal, through a great appeal to the intellect, or to the intellect or good sense. So, Wordsworth further says in his preface that a relationship and love, which it is the great function of poetry, means to make a relationship with mankind and also give love to mankind. And he further says that is the great function of poetry, and he also further says they are to be induced means succeed in leading through a purification means the purgation of feelings, means it cleans the feelings of the mankind and makes man better human being, philosopher, and moral and permanent though. So it is through a great appeal to the intellect, means through a purgation of feelings, or rather than through a great appeal to the intellect or good sense, means it makes purification of the soul, heart, mind, and everything, and makes mankind ideal one. This is what distinguishes Wordsworth's concept of teaching from that of his neoclassical predecessors, because this is what William Wordsworth discusses in his preface to Lyrical Ballad, the concept of poetic diction and concept of poetry, and this teaching is definitely become fruitful for the human beings, and at the same time definitely it is different from the Wordsworth neoclassical predecessors, means the neoclassical poets before William Wordsworth, or the time of William Wordsworth, who has bitterly attacked, mercilessly attacked on the very object of William Wordsworth about the presentation, selection of the language of lower and middle class men. So, my dear students, this is a little bit about the concept of poetry that William Wordsworth mentions in his preface to Lyrical Ballad. In this way, we will come to conclusion of this concept of poetry. Tomorrow, we will just highlight the concept of poetic diction and concept of poetry, and we will finish William Wordsworth Unit 1. So with this, I stop here. Thank you very much.